کنفرانس بین المللی پاریس با حضور رئیس جمهور برگزیده مقاومت، پایان دادن به اشغال اشرف توسط نیروهای عراقی، تضمین حفاظت مجاهدان اشرف، 13 آوریل 2011 24 فروردین 1390.
Thank you very much, Madam Rajavi, and the organizers. Many thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be here today. Except for what we've just seen, this is an enormous tragedy for the people of Camp Ashraf, their friends, their families, and indeed anyone who cares about legitimate political dissent. This is something that has not received adequate publicity in the United States, or apparently in Europe, and something that I hope that here today we can help change. I want to talk about what I think the U.S. role here ought to be in terms of dealing with Camp Ashraf and also the terrorist designation for the MEK, which, as General Shelton said, is under review pursuant to a court order by a court in the United States. But let's go back to the beginning of the direct U.S. relationship with the MEK. During the entire period when the United States provided protection and assistance at Camp Ashraf, there were no incidents whatever that gave our military cause for concern. This is an incredibly important historical record, not one that's well known even in the United States. But whether you agreed with that decision or not, the decision is made now, whether you agree with it or not, that our forces are going to come out. They are coming out. They're down to an absolute minimum. And by all accounts, by the end of this year, they'll be gone entirely. But what the United States did was to say to the government of Iraq, among other things, you have to undertake the obligations that we undertook for the residents of Camp Ashraf. This is something that the government of Iraq committed to, as it committed to the Fourth Geneva Convention, and that this obligation was something that they understood and undertook willingly. Now, twice in the past 2 years, military forces of the government of Iraq have attacked Camp Ashraf. This is not even close to fulfilling their obligations. Moreover, in this recent attack, they said that they were engaged in trying to resolve a property dispute. Now, that's the line they put out to the gullible Western press. Not even in the Wild West were property disputes resolved the way that you've just seen. This is utterly unacceptable. But the fact is that it is not within the power of the United States to use military force at this point to stop what you just saw. Again, whether you agree or disagree with that decision, that's the fact. What that means really, though, is that it puts far more importance on the political leadership of the United States, on the President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, to say to the government of Iraq, we want your obligations, which you undertook voluntarily, to be upheld. We understand that some U.S. military personnel have been allowed into the camp, although the public position of the administration so far is that they're going to report what they saw only to the government of Iraq. I find this difficult to understand. I think the government of Iraq already knows what happened at Camp Ashraf. They don't need the Americans to tell them what they already know. What we need is for the Americans who were there to be able to tell the American people and to tell the American Congress, because that is information that they need to understand what's going forward in Iraq and how to provide the protection that the residents of Camp Ashraf need. Now, it's very clear, I think, that one reason that the administration in Washington has been silent is that it sees political complications in speaking the truth. These kinds of political complications have emerged before. In the mid-1990s, when the MEK was listed as a terrorist organization for the first time, it was perfectly obvious that the major factor in that decision was a desire to appease the mullahs in Tehran in the hope that we would find a path to negotiation over the regime's role as the world's central banker of international terrorism and its dogged pursuit of nuclear weapons. Well, that didn't work then, did it? The government of Iran is still the world's leading financer of terrorism, and it's even further along in pursuing nuclear weapons. When the administration that I served in, coming to its end, looked again at that terrorist designation, it decided to keep the designation in place for the same reason, in the hope that the government in Tehran would be satisfied that keeping the MEK on the terrorist list would be a basis for negotiation. And that hasn't worked either. The fact is the government in Tehran is not going to negotiate in good faith over its nuclear weapons program. It wants nuclear weapons. It sees it as a trump card. And there's nothing in the prospect of negotiations that will convince the mullahs to give up their support for international terrorism. So the fact is that keeping the MEK on this list of foreign terrorist organizations creates the following anomaly. As far as I know, and you've heard the number of governments that have ended the designation, as far as I know, there are only two governmental entities in the world that believe the MEK is terrorist. One is the government of Iran, and the other is the United States State Department. Now, if I were still in the State Department, I'd be a little worried about that. And in fact, that's why I think getting the facts out about how the government of Iran continues to do whatever it can to eliminate the MEK as an effective opposition group is so important, and how grave the risk is that its influence in the al-Maliki government has gotten to the point where al-Maliki can escape responsibility for this. But what it boils down to basically is the absolutely critical importance of making it declared American policy to change the government in Iran. You know, many critics of past U.S. policy have said, oh, you know, this idea of regime change that the Americans pursue all around the world, it's just the wrong thing to do. It's just another example of American hegemonic aspirations, that regime change isn't something that the United States or the West should aspire to. I don't agree. I don't agree at all. That clearly are not going to negotiate themselves out of power. What is the alternative? What is the alternative to regime change? The alternative is more attacks on innocent refugees at places like Camp Ashraf. So let's be very clear here. The politicization of the terrorist designation process has got to stop. The facts have got to fall where they may. I'm not aware of any information about the MEK that should lead to its continuation on that list. If the State Department has something, they're under court order to resolve it. And I think it needs to be resolved as early as possible, because as long as the government of Iran and the State Department are of the same view, the people of Iran are that much farther away from getting a government that legitimately represents them and their interest in the future. Thank you very much.